لهم حديد ونار لهم حديد ونار وهم من القش أضعف.
Welcome back to the Arab Tyrant Manual podcast. I'm Ahmed Gatnash and I'm joined today by Iyad al-Baghdadi. It's been a long time, Iyad.
It's been a long time. And as you can see, I'm wearing my Santa suit with the beard and the red shirt. But yeah, very glad that the Arab Tyrant Manual is finally out of hiatus and we can say hi to our fans again and we can restart the conversation. It feels like everything has changed, and I suggested this first episode, to be focused on how everything has changed.
Yeah, so I think we're gonna go over what's changed, like personally, in this episode. We're gonna go over what changed within our team and at Kawaakibi Foundation over the last 2 years, and then we're gonna look at the world, because obviously the world has changed a lot in 2 years, but there's also a lot of subtleties in the changes that affect, civil society and the human rights space and the global fight against authoritarianism. So, why don't we start from the top? What's changing with the podcast? We're going to be regular again. We're going to be broadcasting once every 2 weeks, available on your favorite podcast app. We're going to be on video. So if you're not watching this, it's on YouTube as well. And
I believe this is the first time that we're actually doing this format with video. But it seems, if this works and if the format works, I think we will have all of our episodes going forward on video as well.
Yeah, and we also have a second podcast starting, which is going to be different from this one. It's called Intergalactic Tarboush. So you can tell from the name, Tarboush is a fez, by the way. You can tell from the name it's quite out there, but it's basically more of a personal podcast by myself and Iyad, and we're just going to talk about our interests and be less political, and things that we're looking at in the world generally. So 1 week we'll be talking about our workout routines, the next we'll be talking about cryptocurrency, and then the third we'll be talking about evolutionary psychology or whatever.
Yeah, so this was a chance. The last 2 years, I guess, were turbulent for everybody, I think, but were especially turbulent for us. We have been on hiatus practically since 2019. We did a couple episodes in 2020, but really they weren't really that well promoted, and we were not really ready to really come back with any regularity back then. And so I feel that this is the true reset. And we are in a good shape right now to make this regular going forward.
So Iyad, why don't you explain why we went off the radar in the first place?
Well, this was in 2019, and I believe we kind of were semi-regular until around May or April of 2019, when those dramatic events happened with my life. When I was contacted by Norwegian intelligence and told that I'm a target, I'm a target of a Saudi threat. And of course, after that, there was a lot of personal turmoil, because when they tell you that, hey, Mohammad Bin Salman wants to kill you, it's not like they knock on the door and they leave. There's a lot that happens after that. So it impacted. It impacted our work, but it also complicated everything. It complicated meeting in person, traveling, digital security, my own living situation, my family's living situation. My parents at the time were refugees in Malaysia, and we had to act very quickly to secure them and make sure that they're in a safe country. Thankfully, they're in Canada now. But there was, there was really a lot going on in my personal life, which as a result, I don't want to call it really personal, because a lot of it is because of work. When someone wants to kill you for your work, it is really personal, but it's also about your work. But that was when we realized that, first of all, it was impossible for us at that point to do anything with any regularity, because there was a lot of instability and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of things that we have to do in order to re-secure ourselves. But I believe it was around July or August when we started talking about, what this means for our work. For the longest time, since 2017, I believe, we were mostly reliant upon our own audience for funding. We had a crowdfunder in 2017, and we had like the Patreon since I think it was 2017 or 2018, can't remember. But we were basically audience funded. Plus, we had some grants from some foundations within Norway. But it wasn't exactly that. We weren't exactly institutionalized. It was just enough for us to get by. And that was our own way of maintaining our independence, I guess. But then after the events of 2019, we realized that it's kind of our go big or go home moment. The work got complicated. We're basically on the world stage, and we needed to build an institution and build power and build a formidable organization with proper funding, proper processes, or we really couldn't sustain our activity anymore. So we decided, if it's either go big or go home, to go big. And that's what we spent the last 2 years doing, building a foundation, building an institution.
So there was a while where it was becoming pretty stark. We were you're being basically hunted by one of the richest men in the world, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. We're consulting different international organizations, governments, social media companies, and another of the richest men in the world on various issues like disinformation being produced by autocracies. And meanwhile, we're just like a team of volunteers.
Well, the first richest man in the world here is Mohammed Bin Salman, and the second is Jeff Bezos. And that's a crazy story. I don't think we actually did an episode just explaining that whole story, but
and also the fact that he's consulting us while we're a team of volunteers funded by a $1,200 a month Patreon.
Yeah, that was crazy. But I guess, it was a scary period of time, but I kind of look back at it with a certain fondness, because it was also exciting, to be honest. It was exciting to be at the middle of all of these, very big events, or at the center of these big events. Just like I told Norwegian security when they picked me up, they showed up at my door and they said, you have to come with us. I said, if they don't want to kill me, then I'm not doing my job. In a twisted kind of way, it's kind of a compliment. But yeah, otherwise, I guess we should also mention that between now and then we published a book. We have the Middle East Crisis Factory is published.
And we've really underdone the promotion on that as well, so people will be hearing more about that.
Kind of I think in my mind, it's we're kind of overdue to actually start promoting it properly. There's always this idea that once we're able to travel, we can do kind of a proper book tour. But then COVID kind of threw everything into disarray. But yeah, we Middle East Crisis Factory is out. In fact, our next episode, I believe, is going to be a deep dive into the book. And personally speaking, I guess, of course, you have the big update because you got married and moved to Wales.
Yeah, and I joined KF full time, so I'm no longer the part-time volunteer.
Exactly. But yeah, personally, I guess one thing I would flag also, because this is a topic that we will be talking about at the Arab Tyrant Manual a lot. I graduated my PTSD. I've been in therapy for PTSD since 2017, and this last May, my therapist kind of said, you don't need to see me anymore. You're good. Which I saw it's not very often that someone actually loses their diagnosis for PTSD. Of course, I still have PTSD, but talking about trauma and talking about trauma recovery and talking about a new project of ours called Shifa is also going to be part of our work here at the Arab Tyrant Manual. And of course, I lost a quarter of my weight since 2019, which is, I guess it's been. Of course, it's a lot of turmoil, but there are some bright spots.
So we went from a small team to an organization basically over the last couple of years. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, yeah. You mentioned, of course, how you're now a full-timer with our team, where in 2019 you were not. But like over the years, we've been working as a team since 2013. But it was always kind of it wasn't really formal. Keep in mind, in 2013, we hadn't met in person. We were mostly collaborating on a book project, and in 2014 and 2015, I was between prison and a refugee camp, and scrambling to piece my life together basically after all of that.
And we did a whole episode on this whole story a couple of winters ago.
And so throughout the years, we had already developed some pretty good ideas about how, if we are to build an organization, what we would be doing and how we would conduct our work. Keeping in mind, of course, I have a background in startup consultancy. So like for 10 years before 2011, my job was to start up startups. We were always eclectic, and we were always different in our approach than a traditional human rights organization. To the point that sometimes we used to discuss this, when we used to discuss this among ourselves, we used to kind of wonder, do we really fit the mold of a human rights organization? We also have a good platform on, specifically on Twitter. We have connections, we have proven work across many fields. When I say eclectic, I mean that we've done investigative journalism, we've done disinformation work, we've done political analysis. We've done, of course, op-eds, writing. We wrote a book. We've written strategies. We've done media. But we were always doing these things in series. Like we're doing one after the other because we lacked the bandwidth to do everything at the same time. And so when we decided, this is the time for us to build an organization, we had to take the time to write everything into a strategy. And that's a strategy, of course, we're pretty proud of. We brought all of this expertise, all of these ideas, and even more. Like I think it's like 200, 300% more now. And now it's like nearly 2 years later, and here we are. The Kawaakibi Center is on good footing institutionally, and I think we're ready to have a really good 2022, hopefully, and to start surfacing the stuff that we've been working on for a long time.
And one of the things we've been talking about most is basically sustainability. I'm not sure if we've discussed it before on this podcast, but our focus has always been on making sure that we can do this in the long term and that we don't burn out and it's sustainable long term. So part of our media plans for the next year, putting this podcast on a regular schedule, starting the other podcast and a few other projects that people will be seeing soon, is basically that we want to have our own revenues from the media we produce, so that we're not dependent on anybody else in order to be able to keep doing our work.
It's probably a good idea at some point actually to do an entire episode about the evolution of social media platforms and how increasingly they're they're adding monetization options and what this means long term, because it might be that we had kind of a collective moment where we are collectively very critical towards the advertising-based model of the internet in general, but that would be an interesting conversation. But as a segue here, because I think we are to.
Well, I think just to add, the really interesting part is the fact that this may really lead to an explosion of new human rights activism and a spring for human rights activists, because it allows them to be sustainable for the first time. Like, we've seen so many amazing people come and go over the last decade just because they couldn't keep doing what they were doing. It was detrimental to their personal lives and to their finances. And this has the possibility of changing that. And we're really trying to create a model.
I hope so. And as a segue, maybe I should ask you this question. What do you think is the most exciting thing as you look forward to 2022, like among everything that we're working on?
So I think you're going to expect me to say our work on Bitcoin, which does massively excite me, but so does our mental health stuff. And I think really at the core of it is the opportunity to actually build things rather than talking about them. So too many people try to advocate for others to do the things they want to see in the world, whereas we're actually going to be building systems ourselves. And that's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, you're right. I totally predicted that would be what you'd pick, but I could answer in many different ways, but I think the one thing that excites me the most is bringing in cool new people into the team, and the big names that we will be declaring, making public soon. I think that's what excites me the most. Like really working with your comrades, it just really feels great.
So onto the world. What changed in the world over the last 2 years, apart from this pandemic some people may have heard of?
Well, I mean, the question is where do we start? Because I mean, if we want to start from 2019.
So last time we did an episode, Donald J. Trump was still president of the USA.
And I think the Trump years have changed the world order in ways that I think many people anticipated, but I think it's also that many people at the time kind of wanted to see Trump as an aberration in the world. Of course, I mean the idea was this is an exceptional period, and then after Trump is voted out or whatever, maybe we're going to return to some kind of normalcy. But I think the Trump years have had such a great, it's such a deep impact. I think not as a change in anything. I think it was more of an accelerator, and it allowed some pretty bad people to make some progress in their own plans, which are pretty terrible towards really bad objectives. But in a certain sense, I don't know, this is like we kind of think differently about strategy in this team. And I don't think that's very bad. It's not too bad. It's not all bad when terrible people, dictators, occupiers, etc., show their true face and show their true intentions. In fact, when you give them space, sometimes they show you who they are. They give you information about what they're planning, and sometimes they become reckless. And when they become reckless, they make mistakes. And that in a certain sense, of course, they hurt a lot of people. I mean, we would know more than many. But it also creates this new reality where you have to deal with you have to really upgrade your strategic thinking.
So I think one of the most explicit forms of this was that basically during the Trump years, Israel kind of came out as a proud member of the axis of autocracy in the Middle East. Rather than this masquerade of being the region's only democracy, they basically firmly planted their flag as being in support of the regional order of authoritarianism. And that was something that Trump's presidency allowed them to do. They invested really heavily in him. They invested heavily in Mohammad Bin Salman, in the UAE. We had this normalization of several of the regional governments with Israel, and it became really clear in a way that nobody can deny now that there's basically an agreement that in exchange for their recognition, Israel basically ensures that democratization efforts are thwarted. Like NSO Group was one of the most prominent examples of this, where this spyware that former military coders, I guess, from elite cyber intelligence units of the Israeli IDF moved into the private sector and built and then sold to authoritarian governments across the world, and it just became a global menace. Because it went from, advanced cyber capabilities went from being something very tightly controlled to something every Tin Pot dictator and his gang could purchase very easily and menace journalists and hunt them down with it, and activists and so etc.
I mean, it was really, the writing was on the wall as far back as 2017, because it was in 2017 that the Saudis got NSO software. But if you remember, Ahmed, in 2016, when we were discussing the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, and he was kind of having these kind of meetings with various people, trying to convince them that he's the one to rule. He's the reformer. He's the that liberal reformer figure everybody was waiting for. Of course, the reality of who he is now, of course, completely manifest. We could clearly see an unusual Israeli interest in him. The way that I see it now, and I know that it might be jarring for a lot of our viewers and a lot of our listeners who are not from the Middle East and North Africa to get a completely different viewpoint about something that maybe they kind of tuned in and out. Maybe they have been fully engaged. I don't know. But for us, this is abundantly clear now that Israel is at the heart, no longer at the margins. I don't think it was ever at the margins, but at least explicitly speaking, manifestly speaking, it is at the heart of the regional order of dictatorships now. And that the Abraham Accords, the so-called Abraham Accords, I really hate using the word Abraham Accords here. I feel it's, as a devout Muslim, I feel that's insulting. But I think they are being sold as peace. They're being sold as people-to-people interaction. They're being sold as, regional integration, as diplomatic accords. But I think they're far. I think what we've seen since then kind of shows us that it's far more than that. This is a strategic alliance, and this is kind of the counter-revolutionary core that existed as far back as 2012, 2013. The same people who fought the Arab Spring in 2011, after 2011, now have a strong and explicit ally in Israel. I do believe that they had relations far before, but now this is completely in your face, completely explicit. And there are Israeli hands in repression across the region. We study this information. This is part of what the Kawaakibi Center does, and we see their hands everywhere. When we look at Pegasus, as you mentioned, we see their hands everywhere. When we look at, recently, for example, there's an ongoing coup and an uprising in Sudan against the coup. And what does it mean, for example, when we read news about how the Americans had to speak to the Israelis to kind of call off the coup or have a different outcome to the coup? It's obvious that they have their hands across the region here, in support of dictators and in opposition to any kind of democratization. I have to tell you, though, of course, this is worth its own deep dive, its own full episode, and I think one advantage of doing this kind of review episode is that we get to, we can always come back and pick one of these topics and do an entire episode or two about it. But I have to say that it kind of feels good that our team has kind of been ahead of the curve when it comes to these things. So, for example, in 2016, we were working on Mohammad Bin Salman, and he only became a widely acknowledged problems in 2018, like 2.5 years later. We were working on Pegasus since 2017. We didn't know that it was called Pegasus back then. We just knew that it was hacking software, etc., provided by the Israelis. And it only became a huge scandal earlier this year. Starting 2018. And I guess, even after the normalization accords between Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, etc., we predicted, they said, we said this is not going to bring any kind of peace. It's actually going to bring just anger. And it was just a few months later when we had, the Sheikh Jarrah uprising in Palestine, and ongoing events, of course. But yeah, that was one of the things that look very different between now and 2019.
So another thing that looks very different is the fact that Mohammed bin Salman is no longer has this shine as an exciting world leader who's promising so much change. He's now somebody who most top level world leaders do their best to keep away from and not be photographed next to. Most notably, Joe Biden is avoiding him like the plague, avoiding him like COVID, you could say. So all of the efforts to kind of make him politically toxic worked, ultimately.
Of course, some people are going to argue that, he's still in power and he is still causing havoc and he is still, he's likely going to be in power for a long time, and all of that acknowledged. But it's also a fact that between now and 2018, there's been there now exists an entire cottage industry of human rights groups and human rights teams and organizations, whose strategy is, a lot of their strategy is focused on countering him, targeting his efforts, whether it is in PR, whether it's an advocacy, whatever it is. Essentially, he created his own opposition. He created a formidable opposition to him. And regardless how much his money can buy, this is going to be a problem for him for a very long time.
So the other thing which really notably changed on a strategic level since our last episode is basically the return to a democratic presidency actually illustrated what hadn't changed. We went through the Biden years, we went through the Obama years, then the Trump years, and now Joe Biden. And one thing that stayed constant through the three is the fact that the US very clearly doesn't want to have much to do with the region anymore. The Middle East is no longer a region of central importance to geopolitics. Oil is no longer, the singular force in global power. We're moving to a post-oil age. And one thing in common with the three presidents is that they want to, reduce their American presence in the region and, clear the headache, because what they get from it is nowhere near worth the amount of energy and money expended. And I think a lot of people are having trouble coming to terms with this. There's people who've been thinking in these terms for decades and decades, that everything that happens in the region has to have happened under the eye of the US, because the US cares so much and is so involved, that, every single country, every single coup, every single decision, every single politically charged event basically happened with their say-so. I mean,
there's always been this idea that America calls the shots, and that America is involved, like you mentioned, is involved in every big event in the region. But I think, even till now, there are people who, as you mentioned, having trouble understanding what is America doing here. If you zoom out and you look globally, the Afghanistan moment, of course, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is when this became abundantly clear, but I think we've been talking about it, me and you, for over a year. Whether it is Obama, whether it is Trump, or whether it is Biden, there was a policy of constant, at least attempting to withdraw, attempting to disengage. I think Obama, as far back as 2008, 2009, he tried to basically pull out from Iraq, and that really didn't work with all of the rise of ISIS, etc. In 2013, again, with the Iran deal, was really about creating this kind of regional order that allows America to kind of withdraw again. Again, that kind of didn't work with the rise of ISIS, with rising tensions, etc. And then with Trump again came in, and he's also talking about withdrawing America from everywhere. But of course he's using different language. He's much more brash, much more aggressive. And then Biden comes in, and again, the main thing is withdrawal. It's and of course Biden's team would tell you that they're repositioning versus China, because China is the main threat, the main strategic threat, as they see, for good reason, of course. And I think it's might be a good idea to actually dive into that for one episode.
The fact is that the region is no longer central to American thinking as it once was.
Absolutely, and I think this is what people need to understand, that everything that America is doing in the region, I don't want to go as far as saying every little thing is motivated by this desire to withdraw, but it is happening within that big context that America wants to disengage. And of course, it's even while doing that, it's trying to balance trying to kind of balance old relationships, old alliances, plus concerns for human rights, etc. You can see this as you mentioned with Joe Biden's treatment of Mohammed Bin Salman, because on one hand, they are diplomatically engaging with him, just not with the president. So it's more it's more a PR move, I guess. It hurts on a PR level, I guess. Or maybe it helps Biden at a PR level, but it's not really. In the end, they're still engaging him. And again, they're engaging him because, whether they give him, a meeting with Biden or not, in the end, America is withdrawing from the region. And in the end, he has to face this region versus larger adversaries that he has not. He's spent, of course, not only him, but the Saudi regime has spent decades fighting and having this, numerous proxy wars against. I'm talking, of course, about the Iranian regime.
So Mohammed bin Salman is allegedly very upset about the refusal of Joe Biden to meet with him face to face and shake his hand. He feels like apparently he's lost a lot from not having that legitimization, and there have been comments that that's what's behind some part of the energy price inflation hitting the US right now. It's basically retaliation for that.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of those smaller countries are also trying to see how much, they're trying to find their own wiggle room. Just today, for example, there's been news about how the UAE is kind of trying to pull, threatening to pull out of a deal to buy F-35s from the United States. Also kind of saying, you know what, if we don't collaborate with you, we can collaborate with the Chinese. It's kind of like they're trying to, again, you have to keep in mind that although these are wealthy countries, strategically speaking, they're small countries as well. I mean, Saudi Arabia is much bigger, of course, it's a different case. But, with the case of the United Arab Emirates, it's small and it's fragile. We have already planned a series of episodes about the UAE in specific, so that we can dive deeper into this context. But I feel like when we're zooming out and we're looking at the Afghanistan moment, and what we called, internally in our notes, we called it the Great American Withdrawal. We feel that the so-called adversaries of the West, even Russia and China, are also reaching a certain tipping point strategically, geostrategically. We can see, for example, that it seems that China, the Chinese regime has become more centralized. It's also become more aggressive and more assertive. And it seems that certain trends in China also, like, you're talking about economic trends, demographic trends, etc., are coming to fruition, to the point that, we don't know how they're going to react to that, or, essentially the next few years are not going to look like the last few years. It's not going to look like more of the same. Same thing with Russia.
So basically what you're alluding to is the Chinese having some significant economic problems with their property market being very heavily inflated, and also their demographic issues with an aging population, which is very dangerous given that a lot of their economic growth has relied on a very young population to power their factories, and they don't have much immigration coming in to do that like a lot of other countries do. So and you also said the changing nature of rule. Basically, Xi Jinping transformed China from, the classical model, which was ruled by the Communist Party as a committee with, a figurehead chosen every few years, to a more traditional one-man dictatorship for life.
Yeah, I mean, and this hyper-centralization, it seems to be driven by a certain anxiety, by a certain sense that we need this kind of central. Of course, it is driven by Xi Jinping's own authoritarianism, of course, but I think beyond that, there is a certain strategic anxiety that we're going to be traversing, some geopolitically difficult few years, and for that reason, we need more control over the state. But before I'd like to start to get to talking about how our outlook has changed as a team, as human rights activists or freedom activists from the Middle East and North Africa. But before that, I think wrapping up this kind of looking at what changed regionally, I think we need to mention a wider regional outlook, because there were, like, between 2019 and now, there have been uprisings in Sudan, in Algeria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran, interrupted by COVID, of course, but in Sudan is basically continued.
In
Palestine, of course, the most recently, earlier this year. But then we've also had some reversals. We've had a presidential coup in Tunisia, which is, again, an ongoing situation, because just yesterday, I think the president declared that there's going to be a referendum and new elections in 2022. We still don't know the details of that. But here, the idea here is that this kind of mirrors what we mentioned in the book, and we will be diving into the book in future episodes. But what we said is that the next 10 or 20 years are going to exist in kind of the same ecosystem, because the world is changing slowly. These long-term trends are kind of like a glacier. the trend itself exists and is going to exist for a long time, but it's slow. And because it's slow, sometimes you miss it. Sometimes you're like, you don't really think that it matters over the next 3 or 4 years, but in the end, what we call unsustainable today becomes a crisis tomorrow. And I think we're going to be looking at a lot of that in the next 20 years. I just have to say that, the resilience.
To give an example of that, nobody decides like the demographics of the country are going to cause a crisis in the next month. There's no individual month where somebody says that the demographics have become a crisis. But if you suddenly skip 10 years ahead, you could be in a crisis. It just happened very slowly and you didn't realize
Exactly.
it.
Just a hat tip to the revolutionaries in Sudan. The resilience of the Sudanese uprising is absolutely stunning. We don't know what's going to happen. We have Sudanese members of the team, prominent Sudanese members, who we are going to declare hopefully next year, over the course of 2022. But I think beyond that, even if we look at Sudan as a phenomenon, if we zoom out, there is a sense in the region that, even though we can have uprisings here and there, we still don't have the momentum. And we have to do a lot more to actually get the momentum.
We're trying to keep episodes of the podcast to a consistent length from now on, so we continue this conversation in the next episode. Tune in then, when we'll discuss our outlook for human rights activism and details of our work and strategy going forward. Alternatively, you can join us on Patreon, where our supporters can access recordings early. Their support enables us to keep doing what we do after all. The link to that is in the episode caption. Thank you for tuning in.
يا مصطفى يا كتابا من كل قلب تألف ويا زمانا سيأتي يمحو الزمان المزيف